Right. All right. We've got some people filtering in, so let's just give it a minute here. For those of you joining us, getting into our Zoom room, we will get started in just about 1 minute. All right, we're just right at 4 o'clock, and it looks like everybody's made it in. So welcome everyone to our Thursday webinar. I am Liz Perry, also joined today by my by multiple friends and colleagues. But before we introduce our speaker, my friend and colleague, Rebecca Renteria, we are here today to bring you through our webinar. Before we get started and introduce our speaker, if you are joining us for the first time, Crow Canyon is a not-for-profit research and education center here in Southwest Colorado. You can find out more about us at crowcanyon.org or email or call us, and we would love to talk to you. We are on Zoom today, not quite ready up and running on Facebook yet, but we are working on it. So you can join us on Zoom today. Please do put your questions if you have them at any time during the presentation in the Q&A, and we will get to them a little bit later. And this, like many of our past webinars, are also on our YouTube channel, which rocks. So if you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do. I go back all the time and rewatch presentations and talk about them. I'd like to begin with some acknowledgements. We acknowledge the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. With the work we're doing at Crow Canyon, we seek to bring light into the darkness of memory that these lands, waters, wildlife, and her descendants hold because of policies of removal, genocide, and displacement. We seek paths that support and align with Indigenous people and communities, and with gratitude, we honor the contributions of present-day Indigenous communities, descendants, and the colleagues with whom we partner, who guide our work and our mission. Some announcements. If you are a graduate student, it is time, it's every 2-year cycle, to apply for the Lister Fellowship. Our last Lister Fellow, Kelsey Henson, finished her PhD and got a job. So it can be a very auspicious thing to be a Lister Fellow. So give us a shout if you have any questions. And the application deadline is October 15th of this year. We also have a bunch of trips coming up that there's still some seats on. The closest one is a short workshop, a 3-day Indigenous Foodways workshop in August. So please take a look at that first. Seats are going fast, and then take a look at our other trips here in Glen Canyon and Southern Arizona coming up. So as you probably know from communications and social media and from our webinars, our spring appeal this year has been to help replace some of the lost funding from National Science Foundation, other threatened funding, federal funding programs. And we actually, when we announced this, we had a very generous former board member and family who said that they would match everything that we were able to raise for the spring appeal. So up to $50,000, which makes it $100,000. So if you are so inclined and want to support these programs, your dollar will be matched. So please take a look on our website. You can look at this QR code if you'd like to come and support some of our programs like College Field School, Outdoor Museum on the Ground, things that are really important to us and have been challenged in particular this year. Next couple of Thursdays, we have a long-time partnership with the Four Corners Lecture Series. This is a community community lecture series project that we have been, since COVID, actually, helping to support. So we have lithophones in Colorado next week, really unique topic, so please join. And then the week after that, we have the importance of information professionals in research. Really a good time right now to dig into all aspects of archaeology. As always, this webinar series is completely free, supported entirely by your generosity, by donations, and initiated by our dear friend and colleague, Taylor Hasbrook, who is no longer with us in person, but is always with us every week in spirit. So we love you, Taylor, and we love all of you who donate constantly to the webinar series to keep it free and accessible to everyone. Thank you all for your generosity. Without further ado, I'm particularly excited this week because our speaker is also our colleague and our friend, our postdoctoral scholar here at Crow Canyon. And so it's just really exciting to be able to have our own researchers present some of their work to the public and to all of us. So it is my absolute honor to introduce Katie Williams. Katie has a Bachelor's of Science in Chemical Engineering from the Colorado School of Mines, a Master's and a PhD in Anthropology from the University of New Mexico. Her postdoc here at Crow Canyon is in geospatial work. She was born and raised in Albuquerque and is also an enrolled member of the absentee Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. Her dissertation research focused on examining the organization of architectural labor at alcove communities in northeastern Arizona, but she has also worked in other parts of the U.S. Southwest and is excited for the opportunity to work at Crow Canyon and spend time in the Colorado portion of the Four Corners. Her research and field experience to date has combined her interests in heritage conservation, material science, labor organization, community construction practices, community distribution across the landscape, and earthen architectural materials. When not working, Katie enjoys spending time with her 2 dogs, eating green chili, and catching up on books, movies, and TV shows. We are so lucky to have Katie at Crow Canyon with us, and so lucky to have you talking about your research today. Welcome, Katie.
All right, thank you, Liz. Let me get my screen shared here. How's it looking?
Perfect.
All right. So I'm gonna introduce or say hello in Shawnee to kind of start off. Hato chakiwieta noki hoesa kiseki, which just says hello everyone and good day. I apologize in the background. You'll probably hear my dog Blue Jay. She's adding her opinions to this talk. As Liz mentioned, I am the postdoc in geospatial archaeology here at Crow Canyon. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is LiDAR, which has been kind of the focus of my postdoc. Before I get into LiDAR, though, let's see here. There we go. Just a little bit more about me. Liz did a great job covering kind of all the bases. I'm from New Mexico, born and raised in Albuquerque. I am an enrolled member of the absentee Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma and have been taking Shawnee classes and trying to learn more of the language. And I went to Colorado School of Mines as an undergrad and to the University of New Mexico for grad school. And prior to coming to Crow Canyon, most of my archaeological kind of fieldwork experience was in New Mexico or northeastern Arizona. And my dissertation work did take place at Batatacan and Keats Seal, which are ancestral communities located in northeastern Arizona as part of Navajo National Monument. So just wanted to give kind of a visual to go with the bio a little bit here. Today I'm going to try and cover quite a bit of material, and I'll try to make sure I don't fly through it too quickly. I'm going to start by going over some basics of LiDAR, what it is, what it means when we talk about point clouds and visualizations and interpolations, and kind of how that comes together to give us ultimately the data set that we're using when we're looking at these landscapes. And then I'm going to walk through some of the work I'm doing here at Crow Canyon for our LiDAR project. And I'm going to end by talking a little bit about the concept of data governance, which is a very important aspect of working with any sort of Indigenous data, but particularly in this context, working with spatial data on ancestral landscapes. So LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. And in archaeological contexts, we typically kind of think about LiDAR in a couple of ways. The first is terrestrial LiDAR, and that is LiDAR that is aimed at documenting structures or architecture, things like walls or roofs, And it's usually ground-based. And so you have your sensor kind of on the ground and you move it from point to point. But there's also airborne LiDAR, and that is what I'm going to be focusing on today. And that's what kind of my whole postdoc here at Crow Canyon is really oriented towards. And with airborne LiDAR, you're kind of taking a bird's eye view and a bird's eye perspective of the landscape. And on this screen, I have two images, and these two images show the same parts of the landscape. If I can get my laser pointer going here. On the left, I have what is called a hillshade. And this is kind of the traditional way that LiDAR is presented in archaeological publications. It is just one way of visualizing the landscape through the use of LiDAR data. And then on the right over here, I have a satellite image, both showing the exact same area. And one of the strengths of LiDAR, one reason that archaeologists are using it increasingly and have been using it for the past decade or more, is that with LiDAR, you can see things that you can't see just visually. You can't really see in the satellite image. So what does light detection and ranging actually mean? My rather cartoonish drawing over here on the left kind of depicts a fixed wing aircraft or plane. The basic idea here is that you have a transmitter and a sensor affixed to your aircraft, and you can also use a drone for this work. But that transmitter is sending out light. It may be visual light or near infrared or some other form, depending on how fancy your LiDAR setup is. But you're sending out light, and that light is traveling from the transmitter to a surface. And in this case, since we're talking about airborne LiDAR, that surface is going to be the surface of the Earth and everything that is on the Earth. So in this drawing, each of these dashed lines are a light signal being sent out from the transmitter, and each point of light is going to impact something on the surface and be reflected back. Those reflections are called returns, and each return that is picked up by the sensor gives us a point in space, both in the horizontal space, X, Y kind of coordinates, but also in the vertical space or a Z coordinate. So on the right side of the screen here, I have a visual representation of a 3D point cloud. And this is a view kind of at an oblique angle. In the background, I just have the satellite image kind of showing the landscape, but all of this rainbow imagery towards the front, that's an actual point cloud. And you can see up kind of above the landscape, there are these red points. Those are probably noise in this particular case, but they're a good example of when the light from the LiDAR transmitter contacts something and goes back, we know exactly where that something is in space. So one of the strengths of LiDAR is that light can penetrate through vegetation, and in some cases, you can see the ground below vegetation. Actually, in most cases, I should say. You can see the ground below the vegetation. And so this means that we can see kind of the bare earth landscape without having to excavate. And this makes LiDAR a very powerful tool for archaeologists. Also, on the bottom of this slide, I have a little bit of a flow chart kind of laid out. And this first part of the presentation, I'm really going to try and focus on all of the decisions and choices that go into taking the data that's kind of in this point cloud form, what we actually get from a LiDAR acquisition process, all the way through a sort of final derivative raster like that hillshade that I showed earlier. Because even though it seems oftentimes like a magic wand, there's actually a lot of decision-making and even math that goes into processing these point clouds. And depending on what you choose and how you decide to select certain classes of points or interpolate, which are both things we will talk about shortly, it can really impact your final visualization. So this slide kind of illustrates the idea of point clouds a little bit better. On the upper left, if you can see my laser pointer, this is an example of some architecture. It's at a community center here in Southwest Colorado. Below that, I have a box that illustrates just a square meter area on the ground. And this box has 3 dots in it. Each dot in the box is supposed to represent some hypothetical LiDAR return points. So in this case, we would have a point cloud density of about 3 points per square meter. And then here I have a video, which hopefully will play. Yes. So as it kind of zooms in, we go from seeing this sort of continuous, colorful kind of rainbow landscape to seeing the individual dots for the individual LiDAR points. And we can see that there's space, quite a bit of space in this case between the LiDAR points. And we can also see that in some cases, as for example, underneath this roof structure, there are no LiDAR points. And so this is just to really illustrate that when we're actually collecting the LiDAR, we have real data about fixed points in space, but we also have a lot of space where we don't have any information. So when we go from the point cloud towards our final visualizations, we do this by way of a digital elevation model, or a DEM. I have on this slide some examples of some different visualizations that we can derive from this LiDAR data, as well as an example of a DEM, and that's kind of down here in the center. The DEM is kind of its own step too in the process of going from the point clouds to the final derivative raster. And these digital elevation models are, just as they sound, kind of a digital raster-based representation of the landscape. And so this is part of what makes LiDAR so powerful, is that with these digital elevation models, you can look at the landscape in ways that you could never actually do in person, because clearing all the sagebrush, removing all of the architecture, cutting down all of the trees is something that is very beyond the scope of most traditional landscape interactions, I would say. So when we talk about digital elevation models, we can kind of divide those into different types of digital elevation models. Many archaeologists talk about bare earth digital elevation models. And essentially, in that situation, we have mathematically subtracted or removed all of the vegetation from the surface of the earth so that we're left with only the ground. And I have an example of that on the left-hand side of the screen with the digital elevation model in the upper left and a hillshade kind of rendering of that model down below. But we can also use digital surface models wherein we keep the vegetation. We might keep all of the vegetation. We might choose to select for only specific types of vegetation. And the result is that when you apply a visualization like a hillshade to that model, you're able to see kind of a more realistic representation of the surface of the Earth as it is today, or as it is at the time of the LiDAR acquisition. So the difference between these two digital elevation models really comes down to selecting different classes of points in your LiDAR point cloud. So in that drawing that I had of the airplane going over a landscape and the light coming out of the plane and impacting or reflecting off of different objects and different surfaces, some of those light beams touched trees and went back up. Some of them touched shrubbery like sagebrush and went back up, and some of them touched the ground. Well, based on the relative positions and intensities of those reflections and those returns, you can actually filter and select only those points that made it through to the ground surface, or only those points that reflect vegetation, or only those points that reflect architecture, and so on. And some of this class selection requires a little bit of advanced LiDAR knowledge that I haven't quite gotten into yet. So I'm mostly relying at this point on class selections that other people have derived. But in this image, I have some examples of the impact of those class selections. And again, it's that differentiation between a bare earth model and sort of a digital surface model. On the left, you have the full LiDAR point cloud, including noise, including vegetation. And then on the right, you have the essentially bare earth or ground-only LiDAR point cloud that has effectively mathematically removed all of the vegetation from the surface. So this slide has kind of a lot going on. On the top, I have a hillshade representation. of the same sort of architectural area that I've been talking about. And then the two images on the bottom are digital elevation model representations. The column in the center, that's the same area, just one is a hillshade view and the other is the DEM itself. And these are all bare earth views. So for these images, I have filtered and selected for only the ground points and ground elevations. As you zoom in on either the digital elevation model, which is derived directly from the point clouds, or the hillshade, which is a visualization of the DEM, you can see that you start to get a pixelated surface. And in this specific case, with the data that Crow Canyon is using and is looking at, all of our pixels are about 1 square meter in size. And so that means that each of these boxes, essentially in these images on the right, represents a real square meter of earth on the ground. And you'll notice that each of these boxes is a single grayscale color or a single value of elevation. This is because when we are going from the point cloud, which is those discrete points that have real XYZ kind of coordinate data, to the hillshade or the DEM, which are rasters, we actually have to use something called interpolation. So interpolation is a mathematical way of kind of filling in the holes between the points. This image on the upper left is the point cloud view for the architecture that I showed in that little video clip earlier. And the image on the right is what we call a triangulated irregular network, or a TIN, for those same point clouds. And essentially what a TIN is each actual LiDAR return point, or each point that we have XYZ data for, is the vertex of a triangle, as represented down in the lower right in this 1 square meter area box. And so each of those vertices, we actually know where it's at in space. But all of the points between those are kind of unknown. And we can apply different mathematical equations, essentially, and approaches to try and figure out what elevation value best represents this entire square meter based on those points. And in some cases, people can actually resample down to a higher resolution. For example, you could get a 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter pixel by, again, using mathematical interpolation to try and kind of fill in the gaps, fill in the blank spaces, so to speak. There's a lot to go into about interpolation. If anyone is very interested in interpolation and kind of examining the impacts that interpolation can have on your final visualizations, I highly recommend this article that I've placed a screen capture of in the lower left corner, where the authors do a really great job of talking about the different interpolations that are commonly applied in archaeology, as well as the effects that those interpolations can have kind of on the final product or the final view that you're able to develop. So with all of that being said, generally we're trying to go from our point clouds to a digital elevation model, and from our digital elevation model to some sort of visualization that lets us really see kind of what's happening on the landscape. So in the upper left, I have the Bare Earth DEM for community center here in Southwest Colorado. It's kind of hard to see a whole lot happening in that DEM. It's a lot of shades of gray. On the right, I have a hillshade, and a hillshade is a specific type of visualization. And it's actually a very powerful visualization because in a hillshade model, we're able to position the sun wherever we think is most helpful to kind of pull out minor or subtle differences in the topography. And in this particular hillshade, the sun is positioned at essentially northwest and about 45 degrees above the horizon. That's a fairly standard positioning. But you could also rotate the sun and put it just about anywhere, including in places that the sun wouldn't actually ever be. And this can give you a lot of insight into different features on the landscape. But one important thing to keep in mind is that, as I illustrated earlier, our pixels in this case are about 1 square meter in size. And this means that if we want to see any features that are smaller than a square meter in size, we're essentially erasing those. They're not going to be visible with the resolution that we're working at. So there's a lot that goes into just getting to the point of having these visualizations from the point cloud. So now I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit and talk a little bit more about what I'm doing here at Crow Canyon. So as I'm sure many of you know, Crow Canyon is located in Cortez, Colorado. This is a map showing kind of the Four Corners region of the United States. We have New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. Cortez is very near to the Four Corners. In the areas with the thick black outlines and the diagonal slashes, that is current reservation or off-reservation trust land. And then the area with the blue polka dots is approximate area of the Central Mesa Verde region. And we have Cortez kind of represented here with the red oval shape. We are here at Crow Canyon very interested in understanding as much as we can about the Central Mesa Verde region kind of specifically, and even more specifically kind of in Southwest Colorado. This slide shows the extent of the LiDAR that we have processed so far. And really, this was processed by a predecessor who I unfortunately was never able to meet here at Crow Canyon by the name of Dylan Schwint, who was just brilliant and whiz at interpolating and pulling together all these massive data sets. And one part of what I'm doing here is kind of expanding on this area slightly. But most of our focus is in Southwest Colorado, in the Central Mesa Verde region kind of proper. Crow Canyon has a very long history of research in this region, as I'm sure everybody is familiar watching these webinars over the many years. Among the data sets that Crow Canyon has for the area is what we call the community-centered database. And if you haven't had a chance to read the book that I've got a picture of the cover of here, there's a really great chapter in that book that kind of summarizes the history of research into community centers and kind of Crow Canyon's various projects that have been involved. To put it very kind of short, just for the purposes of this presentation, there's about 40 years worth of archaeological data collection in these databases and in these data sets. And so part of my job is to kind of revisit some of these data sets with this new LiDAR data. And the LiDAR data that we're working with comes primarily from the United States Geological Survey. They've been collecting and releasing LiDAR data in, I would say, the past 5 or so years. And so this is a really unprecedented opportunity to look at the landscape at a very large scale, but also at a very high level of detail. Again, we're kind of working with 1 meter square pixels, which is pretty incredible when you look at the scale of the area that we are assessing and reviewing. But the main focus of my work right now is to kind of revisit specific communities on the landscape, what we at Crow Canyon and as archaeologists call community centers. And community centers are kind of larger ancestral communities or persistent places on the landscape that archaeologically are defined as having about 50 or more rooms, 9 or more pit structures, and or some form of public architecture. And the map that you see to the left here kind of shows a good portion of the already identified community centers that various archaeologists have contributed a lot of time and energy into documenting and mapping. But as we're looking at the LiDAR, we're starting to identify and see additional features on the landscape that in some cases were documented prior to the LiDAR, and in other cases are new to archaeologists. They weren't things that were recorded during survey or excavation. So this is the same slide that I showed at the very beginning of the presentation when I first introduced LiDAR. Again, I've got the hillshade on the left and imagery over on the right. And this is an example of a community center. And if you look kind of closely at the hillshade, you'll see some features that aren't visible in the satellite view, such as this loop road that we can kind of make out. There's also a potential or actual linear road segment that's visible. And then there is a whole bunch of architecture that is visible. If you switch over to the hillshade or to the imagery view, you can maybe start to see some portions of that loop road. You can see a little bit of the architecture, but it's not nearly as visible. So my job at present is really to go back over this entire landscape with the LiDAR and document additional features and update our databases with this new information. And so the way I'm doing it, because it's a lot of LiDAR to look at, is I have a grid system that I've superimposed over the area, and I'm just going grid by grid. Each of these grid squares is about 5 kilometers on a side, so 25 square kilometers, and just identifying as many features as I can, just visually. This is another example of a community center where with the LiDAR, we are able to see quite a bit more than we could kind of on the ground. If you look at the imagery, you can kind of make out the room block and the masonry. But what you don't see in that image and what you can see in the LiDAR view is this road feature up to the upper right, as well as an area of kind of parallel ridges or berms. And these are things that when you're there on the ground, it's very difficult to see. So I have some examples of that here. This is an oblique view of that same community. This is that masonry block. Here's the road segment kind of going off to the northeast. And then here is the linear or series of parallel ridges. In the image on the right, I'm actually standing on top of one of these ridges and kind of looking northeast-ish. And it's very difficult to see much on the ground. I've added some lines in here that kind of approximately represent where I think some of the other ridges are, as you know, I'm standing there with this image, but it's just a really good illustration of even when you know something is there from the LiDAR and you're standing there, it can be really difficult to see these features sometimes. And on the topic of these features, there are 2 researchers working in Southeast Utah, Fred Niles and Winston Hurst, who have been doing a lot of work documenting these features over in Southeast Utah. And so part of my work as I'm surveying the landscape has been to just see if I'm also seeing these sorts of features, these parallel ridges or parallel berms. And there's a lot happening on the landscape that is kind of new and that we are adding into our databases, which is very, very exciting. It's the Central Mesa Verde region is an area that has been extensively researched by archaeologists. So to, at this point, still be finding kind of new features that archaeologists didn't know about earlier is very cool. Another part of my work, and this is that same community I was showing you earlier, is to kind of look at changes in the landscape over time. Because over here in Southwest Colorado, much of the landscape has been modified. There's been a lot of homesteading and clearing and use of land for agriculture more recently. And this means that we kind of have more of a patchwork of these features over here as compared with Southeast Utah. And so one way of looking at changes in the landscape over time is through looking at aerial imagery that dates back decades. One potential aspect of this, the reason I talked about digital surface models earlier, and those are the models that, again, you don't subtract the vegetation from, is because with this aerial imagery, in some cases, as the satellite or the airplane or the photographer was passing over the landscape, they would take photos that overlapped. And so similar to photogrammetry, if you have photos that overlap to a sufficient degree, you can actually, in some cases, pull elevation data from those overlapping images, and that will allow you to create a digital surface model. And so, for example, one thing I am working on is trying to create a digital surface model from the 1937 Soil Conservation Service imagery that covers much of Montezuma County. And that's kind of illustrated up here in the upper left. Which means that theoretically, I could have a digital surface model in 3D for the 1937 surface of Montezuma County. It's still very much a work in progress. It's a little bit of a difficult task because you have to have a very high degree of overlap, but it's something I'm very excited about trying to untangle and get into a little bit more. Another aspect of the work that I'm doing here at Crow Canyon is thinking about why are we seeing these different features where we're seeing them? Is it because of different preservation or weathering events that have impacted preservation of features? Is it because we're not seeing them elsewhere, but they really are there and we just need to look harder? Are there any aspects of the landscape that can help us kind of puzzle out where we should be looking based on where we're already seeing features? And so I'm doing sort of two different types of suitability analysis. The first is to look at all the spaces where, based on the LiDAR, I've identified new features and kind of assess whether there are other areas that have similar characteristics, and that might be similarities in aspect or essentially which direction the sun shines on the most. You know, is it a north-facing slope, a south-facing slope? The actual percentage or percent change of the slope itself, the type of soil, water availability, and so on. Another suitability analysis that I'm hoping to undertake, which is very, very preliminary at this point, is to look into the agricultural potential. Thinking about what some of these features might be and where they're located. Does that fit with kind of an agricultural explanation? It's a very open question at this point, but my hope is that it will also help me to make sure I've not missed anything on the landscape as I'm going kind of grid by grid across the area. So the other aspect of this work is to revisit each grid in that whole study area using some additional visualization tools. And there is a toolkit that was developed by some archaeologists, a group of archaeologists called the Relief Visualization Toolbox. And up on this slide on the upper left, I have a hillshade view of that same community center I was showing you earlier with the road segment and the ridges and the architecture. And on the right, I have used the Relief Visualization Toolbox to derive what is called a Visualization for Archaeological Topography, or VAT for short. And the VAT really makes a lot of things kind of pop out of the landscape in a more substantial way. And the VAT is actually optimized to highlight those subtle topographic differences by archaeologists who kind of know what to look for on the landscape. And it's a very powerful visualization method. So at the risk of going into too many details, I'm just going to run really quickly through some of that visualization. I mostly work in ArcPro or ArcGIS Pro by Esri. This is just a screenshot of that relief visualization toolbox and kind of the flow chart for taking your digital elevation model, which again can be either a digital surface model or a bare earth model, and kind of running it through different processes to end up with your ultimate VAT blend. And along the way, you're coming up with different derivative rasters. And so you start with your DEM and you create a hillshade. You might also create a slope visualization where each pixel on the landscape is assigned a value according to the percent slope that it's on. And then you might also look at something like openness, which is the exposure of each pixel to direct sunlight. And as you combine each of these visualizations, you end up with this kind of ultimate super visualization that is sort of the result of adding all of these other rasters together. And this is why it's so important with any LiDAR work to be very aware of what interpolation you've been using, what your pixel resolution is, and what your point cloud density was originally, because ultimately you're going through many, many steps to get to your final visualization. So to go back to our first community center that we were looking at, this is kind of the effect of applying that visualization process. So again, on the left, we have the hillshade, and on the right, we have the visualization for archaeological topography. And it really just pulls out certain features, like this road segment is much clearer in the visualization for archaeological topography than it is over in the hillshade. It's still visible in the hillshade, but it certainly pops out more using these advanced visualization techniques. Okay, so with all of that being said, I have a little bit of time now to talk about the concept of data governance. And I'm still kind of learning about data governance in the context of spatial data, but I felt it was a very important concept to kind of end with. Data governance essentially refers to the ability for any group, and in this case, it would be a tribal nation or an indigenous group, to control access to their data, to their land, to their resources, and in this particular case, to maps of ancestral lands and maps of ancestral spaces. There is a lot of I would say logistical nuance as far as data governance and actually enacting data governance goes, particularly in the case of working on ancestral lands as opposed to current reservation lands. However, I feel that it's important to have this conversation even when it's not necessarily clear cut, because this is a map of the United States taken from the Native Lands website. If you haven't gone there, I highly recommend going and checking it out. You can look up whose traditional homelands you are on. The point that I'm trying to make with this map and this next map as well is that all of this is native land. This is all ancestral land. In many, many cases, actually in every case that I am aware of, there are very strong and continuing and ongoing ties between communities and their ancestral lands, even when they have been displaced or removed from those lands. And so on this map, I have Cortez kind of circled in red as well. And when we compare this map, which is, overlapping ancestral lands and territories and language groups, to this map, where a lot of the work we're doing is kind of outside the bounds of traditional consultation requirements, I think it's just important to keep in mind that native land is still native land and ancestral land is still native land. And so when we're working with these LiDAR data sets, it's very critical to make sure that we are having conversations with tribes and talking about where this data comes from and how it's being used and what interpretations we are drawing from this data. Dr. Perry shared our organizational land acknowledgement at the start of this presentation, and so I'm not going to read through it again here. But I just wanted to kind of emphasize that part of being a responsible archaeologist and engaging in a more Indigenous archaeology is making sure that even when things aren't clear cut, even when it's not necessarily required to have conversations, that we're still doing our best to be collaborative and that we're still doing our best to enter into some of these conversations and reach out to descendant communities and tribes and make sure that we are not reenacting kind of the same traditional archaeological practices of doing research kind of in a bubble, right? And so as part of my work here as well, I have actually been reaching out to tribes to start some conversations about this LiDAR and these questions and these data sets and updating these. With that, I think that is all that I have. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Katie. Fantastic presentation, and definitely took some of the mystery out of what is LiDAR to those of us who are not experts in that area. So that was fantastic. And I really liked the little drawings of the plane and that made sense to me anyway. All right. Well, I'll just go ahead and I'll start, and then maybe Rebecca, you can pick the next question, and I'll just kind of start with to reward the folks who put their questions in early. One of the first questions that came in kind of early on in your presentation was, how does altitude affect the data cloud return? If the plane is higher or lower, is there less or more of a data return?
So the short answer is yes. There's definitely there's a relationship between the speed at which your aircraft is going, the height you are above the ground, and then also particularly in the case of something like using the satellite images to try and derive like historic DSMs. If you have clouds that are in the way, that is also going to affect your data collection, your resolution, and the number of returns that you get, as well as just how much light reaches the ground. I am not as well versed in the actual data collection of LiDAR because I'm mostly working with data that's already been collected. But the short answer is yes.
Fantastic.
All right. I can jump in. We have a lot of LiDAR related questions, obviously, and specifically to the generation of data. And we have a couple that are pretty similar, so I'll ask these together. Are you using AI or machine learning to detect sites and or patterns in data sets? And data sets that you have acquired using LiDAR? And do you think these tools are useful in your research and to future archaeological research and heritage preservation?
Yes, that is a big question. Um, I am not using AI at this time. As part of I completely forgot to talk about this, but as part of Crow Canyon's LiDAR project, we actually have a working group of experts, other archaeologists, who are very well versed in using LiDAR, and a couple of them do use AI and machine learning. Um, I think when we're kind of in this exploratory data phase, um, using machine learning is tough because you have to feed it examples of what you're looking for and what you're not looking for. And I think we're still a little bit too early to use that kind of successfully for the specific application that I'm using it. With that being said, machine learning is a really powerful tool. And the fact that there is so much LiDAR coverage available and such an extensive landscape that we can look at really lends itself well to machine learning applications, and particularly actually in the context of preservation. Documentation can kind of be, in some respects, viewed as like a first line of defense in preservation. And so using something like machine learning to make sure that we know what is out there so we know what to protect is very powerful. So it's definitely kind of on the to-do list down the line, I would say.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let's see. Lots of compliments and thank yous for the discussion and the work that you're doing. One of our viewers asks, how does LiDAR compare to ground penetrating radar? Do you use that as well? Is LiDAR only surface level or does it penetrate the ground?
That is an excellent question. So LiDAR does not penetrate the ground at all. It is everything you can see kind of with your eye. It's that same light. Ground penetrating radar is in a lot of instances, it's very, very helpful, of course, because it can help us kind of see below ground. It's ground penetrating. But where LiDAR kind of shines is that with ground penetrating radar, you kind of have to remove, like if you're going to do that on an area where there's a bunch of sagebrush, you kind of have to get rid of the sage before you can scan the ground. With LiDAR, the actual data collection process, you can filter out that sagebrush. So you're not seeing below the ground, but you can see a lot that's on the ground. And this is actually kind of a conundrum. If you're looking at a site or at an ancestral community where you have standing architecture, if you subtract ground or if you subtract non-ground points from your LiDAR model, you might accidentally subtract architecture. So that's another reason that it can be good to look at both the digital surface model and the bare earth elevation.
Sounds like it's a pretty powerful combination looking at those, using those technologies together.
We have another question asking about any recommendations you have for publicly accessible LiDAR sites and kind of thinking about that as well. If you could maybe speak to maybe not specific concerns folks from tribal communities have had, but kind of maybe some of the things that have come up as far as having this information publicly as accessible.
Yeah. So I will say that USGS has been publishing LiDAR data, with the caveat that you have to have the GIS skills to be able to process the point clouds, Or if you work directly with the DEMs that they make available, you also have to be very cognizant and mindful of how they got to that DEM and kind of what you might be missing or what you might be introducing, because one thing I didn't talk about is that sometimes these interpolations or different visualizations can actually introduce artifacts or noise that makes something appear like it's there, but it doesn't really exist. So that's one thing I would kind of put out there. As far as like the second part of that question, I would say that there's an element to this that feels, so it's a double-edged sword because LiDAR is considered non-destructive and it is relatively non-invasive. You are not actually physically altering the landscape in any way. It is also, because you can survey very large areas, very effective technique. But there is an element to it that feels a little bit invasive, especially when you have such high resolutions like 1 meter square areas as a single pixel, because you can go and you can look at any part of the landscape and see a whole lot. And that's, I think, part of the conversation regarding data governance is that these are ancestral lands. All of this data that we are working with is indigenous data. Even though the LiDAR itself was collected by a federal agency, ultimately, the data and the ancestral places and the land itself are all native. And so I would say, as far as concerns, there have certainly been concerns about, things kind of coming up that maybe aren't documented yet. There are potentials for people to use this LiDAR data and this kind of access in an unscrupulous way to access places where they shouldn't be going, whether it's legally they shouldn't be or ethically they shouldn't be. And so I would just encourage people to, if you are thinking about looking at some of this LiDAR, to really think about reaching out to tribes. And if you're looking at any sort of federal land or state land, reaching out to those kind of authority figures as well, just to start conversations and make sure that everybody is kind of comfortable with what's going on.
Thank you. That's a really good point, and a nuance that definitely should be front and center. As you describe it, it does feel like there's privacy, right? Issues. That is non-invasive in one way, but it is it does have a spying kind of element to it that needs to be addressed. There's a kind of a technical question that it must be from a practicing archaeologist, because it sounds familiar, and it actually does kind of tie in a way to maybe some of the privacy and sovereignty issues. But someone asks, can GPS handhelds be linked to the coordinates found on the LiDAR images for survey purposes? Of course, it could also be for purposes that might not be so innocent. So.
Yeah. Yes, they can. There are some software programs out there that allow you to kind of move back and forth between something like ArcPro, where you can generate a map showing whatever it is you want to see, and something like a handheld device. A lot of those are, what's the word? Proprietary. So you have to have like a license and pay a fee. But and theoretically, part of the danger of LiDAR, as we were talking about just a minute ago, is that if you are good at reading maps, or if you know the area you're looking in, you can walk to wherever you are seeing something on the landscape and then use your handheld GPS there as well. One of the benefits of LiDAR for archaeologists is that it does allow for really rapid and kind of large-scale survey and really targeted survey. So as opposed to kind of walking out and seeing what you see, you can go to a specific spot on the landscape where you know there's likely to be something based on the LiDAR. So yeah.
Interesting. Well, so maybe on the flip side of that, obviously there's some risks and there's some dangers to this information being out there. Are there things you're hearing in your conversations with tribal communities that are considered potentially useful to tribal communities, ways in which they might want to have access to these data for management purposes or other purposes?
It's definitely an ongoing conversation. I do know that just like with many agencies, there is a kind of a shortage of funding and an overabundance of tasks. So sometimes having access to something like LiDAR to survey the landscape and kind of keep track of what's happening on the landscape can be really helpful to cultural resource managers, to tribal historic preservation officers, as they can kind of see what's happening at a high speed and at a big scale. I would say so far I have heard more concerns than I have kind of benefits, but we're also just starting to have conversations. There are a lot of people who are very excited about LiDAR and very excited about kind of the new things that we can uncover and learn about connections between places and connections between landscapes using LiDAR. So
Awesome.
Okay, so another question. So given that this work is right now centered in Colorado, and we know that folks that you spoke about earlier were also doing this work in Utah, seen possible similarities among features. Wondering if you could maybe speak to kind of the implications for that as far as really demonstrating that, states as they exist today are kind of these arbitrary boundaries. And yeah, just kind of speak a little bit to, I guess the power of that as far as just representing tribal histories.
yeah, I would say that that phrase of states kind of being arbitrary boundaries is kind of exactly the situation. I mean, to a large extent, I'm starting off focusing in Southwest Colorado because we do have this working group. There are so many archaeologists who are working in this area and who have worked in this area for decades. And at the same time, it does feel kind of arbitrary to be kind of having these dividing lines that weren't there. I mean, clearly, if you look at the distributions of ancestral communities and ancestral features on the landscape, there was no Southeast Utah versus Southwest Colorado versus, New Mexico and Arizona. I will say that it has led to some interesting conversations that we're starting as a working group as far as kind of working across state lines and making sure that we're all documenting things in a similar way and that we're kind of describing things in a similar way. And yeah, I think it is important to remember, though, that these boundaries are really recent and very arbitrary.
Thank you. Well, we just have a couple minutes left. Katie, is there anything else you might want to share about what you're excited about doing next with your research?
I'm just excited to see it all kind of coming together. It's been kind of a steep learning curve for me. My dissertation had nothing to do with LiDAR. So I had kind of like a little bit of knowledge, but jumping in like both feet. It's been really cool to kind of learn about all of this data and how to use it, and even these larger conversations around data governance. And I'm just excited to see where it all goes from here and how these conversations unfold.
Fantastic. So are we. Thank you so much for your work and your presentation today. And as more gets done, we hope you will come back and share it again.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Thanks so much, Katie. And thank you to all of our viewers today. And we will see you next week. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks, everybody.